However, the good news is that everybody can ascend. Everybody has that ability to trace their consciousness back towards the source consciousness and achieve potentialities that we would say are remarkable for turning around people's lives. And the factors that are involved there, besides let's say level of soul awareness or soul growth that you reincarnate with, the factors that evolve there have a lot to do with things like your desire, your motivation, your ability to be open-minded, to use visualization, in the book Quantum Spirituality, I write about the factors of meditation and that help people to propel them to have these kind of extraordinary experiences. And there are different factors that can be played with that can accelerate people's growth.
I'd like to welcome to the show Peter Canova. How you doing, Peter?
Good to see you, Alex.
Good to see you too, my friend. Thank you so much for coming on the show. We're gonna have an exciting talk today about one of my favorite subjects, which is multiverse theory, ancient civilizations, ancient history, spirituality, all of it kind of connecting together. So my first question to you is, how does the multiverse theory align with the ancient spiritual views of reality?
It aligns really well. In fact, I'd go so far as to say that ancient spiritual traditions, particularly the Gnostic spiritual traditions that I concentrate in, really read like a textbook for quantum physics and the creation of parallel universes. If you read the Gnostic texts, it describes a process whereby different levels of consciousness are projected outward. And these levels of consciousness essentially are dimensions. They're separate dimensions of existence vibrating at different frequencies. So this was described pretty thoroughly in the Gnostic texts, and it really really fits very well.
So can you kind of dig in a little deeper into this, into what the Gnostic texts are talking about reality? Because I'm not familiar. I know about the Gnostic text, but I'm not very well versed in it. So can you explain it to the audience a little bit?
Sure. Well, first of all, maybe I should just explain who the Gnostics were, just to put everybody in the same picture. The Gnostics were both a pagan and a Judeo-Christian mystical group. They predated Christianity, but when Jesus started his mission in Palestine, they became amongst the first Christians because they saw that he was teaching essentially a Gnostic message. And the Gnostic creation story really is about the fall of consciousness or spirit energy from a state of oneness into a state of multiplicity. And that multiplicity is really equal to the multiverse that we're talking about, because essentially what they said was that the one consciousness projected itself out into other points of consciousness, which you can call spiritual beings, somewhat analogous to the Christian idea of angels or archangels or whatever, separate centers of intelligence in effect. And that each of these vibrated at a particular level and formed a different sphere or dimension of existence. So essentially what they were describing in non-technical terms was the whole idea of a multiverse, of a layer of parallel universes that led really right on down to the physical dimension in which we believe to be our reality.
So when you're saying parallel realities, are these, this, we're going to go down some rabbit hole here, Peter. So from what I understand, that I've spoken to some spiritual masters that say that every thought or every major decision, let's say, not every thought, not like, cup of coffee or not cup of coffee, any major decision splits you off into another. There's another version of you going off to see how that finishes off. Like, did I take that job in New York or did I not take that job in New York? Did I date Susie or did I not date Susie? That kind of things. And those kind of parallel realities are going off. Is this what they're talking about? Or is it more, there are just a set level of like, look, there's 10, for lack of a better number, there's 10 parallel realities to our current reality. Is that, or which one is it, do you think?
Yeah, well, the first thing that you mentioned is really called the many worlds theory, and that is a theory in quantum physics as well. And the Gnostics describe more of the latter one, not necessarily I don't know if I describe it as fixed. I would say that it is more like that, but there's many of these parallel dimensions of existence. There's a multiplicity of them out there. They in some Gnostic texts, yes, you mentioned the number 10 or 11. They did mention that, which coincidentally is what quantum string theory says, that there are 10 or 11 major dimensions of existence. So, neither quantum physics nor any of the ancient spiritual texts I can find are very precise in terms of saying, what the numbers are. I think what they really concentrate on is the fact that what they're trying to say is, look, the reality that we perceive is not the only reality. In fact, it may be the bottom rung of the ladder, that there are many unseen dimensions of consciousness and intelligent energy that exist prior to us. And I think that's the major point that they're trying to convey, rather than, try and say, well, there's 5,000 of these, or there's 2,000 of these, and right. So forth.
So then would the concept of the ascended masters, which are like the Jesus, the Buddhas, the Yoganandas of the world that walked once on earth and ascended to a higher state of consciousness while on this in this reality, from spiritual texts like the Vedic texts and things like that, it's said that they rise beyond multiple layers and they're still learning at other layers. So in other words, they might be godlike here, but they are still going, like on level 6, they're just starting, or level reality dimension 7, they're just starting. Is that something that you've had any interaction with in your research?
Well, yeah, I've run across that. That's not really what the Gnostic texts say, but I am familiar with that. You have to remember also, just as there are, various views in quantum physics, there's quite a variation in, terms of spiritual traditions. Okay. Generally speaking, they all point toward the same thing, but how you get from, A to Z is quite different in each of the spiritual traditions. So yes, I am familiar with what you just described. I think that there is no question that what it all boils down to is this: we started from one source consciousness. That source consciousness fell in a series of limitations. And what do I mean by limitations? What I mean is dilutions of consciousness. So, for instance, you have to have limitation or dilution of consciousness in order to experience individual existence. Why? Well, simply because if you weren't differentiated from the source consciousness, you'd be the source consciousness. You'd be reabsorbed into the source consciousness. You'd be part of the everything. So that somehow the everything has to fool itself into thinking it's something. And the way it does that is by projecting limited portions of its consciousness out to create these different spiritual centers, to create these different parallel dimensions. So what it really is all about is limitation. Now, taking that into consideration, by the time you get down to where we are, which I think is pretty low in the totem pole, by the time you get down to where we are, you're talking about a lot of limitation of consciousness. So, clearly what these masters are doing, or what anybody who's seeking enlightenment is doing, is increasing their rate of frequency, increasing their rate of consciousness in order to work their way back up the ladder, essentially acquire more awareness, acquire more consciousness, and therefore raise themselves, or you described, to begin that process of reascending.
So would the stories of the yogis, let's say the ancient yogis that were able to do, let's say, quote unquote, magical things like levitation or biolocation or things like that, even within the last 100, 200 years, there are yogis that walk the earth, even currently, who are working the earth, who are quote unquote enlightened beings. Is that what they were doing, in a sense of like raising their vibration to the point where, for lack of a better word, they're Neo and they're starting to see the code of the matrix and are learning how to manipulate it in ways that we just can't comprehend, so it looks magical to us?
Yeah, I think that's a pretty accurate description. I mean, when you have these type of phenomena, non-ordinary phenomenon, to the extent that they're being expressed by these individuals, it means that they've penetrated beyond the illusion of the fact that we're material, because we're not material. What we are is a mixture of, we are energy that has convinced itself that it is solid 3D matter. Okay. And that's not just a spiritual statement. That's a quantum fact. I mean, we all know, I think all your listeners probably know enough to understand that what we view as solid 3D objects, including our bodies, are actually not solid at all. They're composed of subatomic particles with vast quantities of space between them, and that are composed of light energy. And quantum physicists know at the very basis of reality, there is no such thing as matter. All there is a wave of quantum potential, a wave of energy. So energy is primary, and matter descends from energy. Matter essentially is coagulated energy. It's energy that has slowed in vibration. So consequently, you look at something as simple as Einstein's E equals mc squared, the famous equation. What that equation is telling you that matter comes from energy. Energy and matter are interchangeable. And that's the basis of the atomic bomb. The atomic bomb is releasing that captive energy and matter and unleashing that tremendous amount of energy back into an atomic phenomenon. So yeah, I mean, what the gurus or the yogis or whatever you talked about that experience these, that are able to manifest these phenomena, yeah, they would have achieved a level of awareness that essentially has transcended them above the illusion of the fact that we are physical beings, and they're able to manipulate energies at a higher level.
I love that. I never heard it brought to that level, because the concept of we're all energy, and they're at a subatomic level where there is mass amounts of space. But I love when you said that it's energy that is slowed down and coagulated to believe that it's solid. That actually makes a tremendous amount of sense to me, because the higher the vibration, I guess the less coagulated it is in many ways, which then it goes along with what these ancient stories of yogis, or even Jesus's miracles in the Bible and what he was doing. He was doing very yogic things back then, these miracles, because he was probably, again, he was the Neo and was seeing behind the code, if it will.
Well, one of the most astonishing things that I chronicle, or I talk about in my new book, Quantum Spirituality, is that I demonstrate very graphically how the Gnostic text predicted almost every major theory of quantum physics. And one of the most striking things that they predict is what's called the God particle. Now, you may have heard of the God particle. It was in, I think, one of Dan Brown's movies. And in 2012, they finally found the little bugger that they've been looking for 50 years, called the Higgs boson. That's called the God particle. And essentially what the Higgs boson does is that when matter enters into our universe, and incidentally, scientists don't know I should say when energy enters into our universe, scientists do not know what energy is. Okay, if you ask a scientist what is energy, they're either lying to you or they'll just be honest and say, we have no idea. They can manipulate it. They know how to manipulate it for certain purposes under limited circumstances, but they don't know where it comes from, and they really don't know what it is. Energy comes into our universe at a high rate of frequency. And what happens is that our universe is surrounded by a blanket, in effect, called the Higgs field. And the Higgs field contains these bosons. They're kind of almost like virtual particles, Higgs bosons. And the Higgs bosons attach themselves to these high streams of energy, and they begin to slow them down. So think of, like, for instance, you take a gun and you start shooting it into a swimming pool, okay? The water from in the swimming pool slows the velocity of the bullet, as opposed to the bullet traveling through just plain air. So the Higgs boson essentially acts in the same way. It slows down these high energy streams to the point where they start to take on mass. They start to take on the characteristics of mass or matter. This is now pretty much scientific fact. So the Gnostics describe this exact process as one of these high Gnostic beings, basically an aspect of God or an aspect of the source, falls into a dimension called chaos, which is really, chaos is part of quantum physics too. Chaos is basically unformed potential. It's potential, it's in potentiality. It hasn't actually coalesced into an object yet, okay? But it's an object in potential. So this figure falls into chaos, and it's a high energy figure, and it's surrounded by what the texts call proto matter. which is astonishing because that's like another word for virtual particles. So these virtual particles and potential swarmed around this high energy being and lowered her frequency. And she starts crying out to heaven, I'm becoming mass, I'm becoming matter, I'm becoming as lead, save me. And essentially the whole story from then on is about how this interaction with that high energy stream slowed down by these virtual particles leads to the formation of matter. It's like astonishing. It's an exact description of the God particle.
So if we're all in agreement that we're all energy, and really we should be able to just walk through walls or walk through anything because there's really no matter, quote unquote, on a subatomic level, what is the organizing factor that makes Peter Peter and Alex Alex? What is the intelligence that is holding all of these protons and neutrons and electrons together to form these beings that are Peter and Alex?
Okay, well, there's a short answer and there's a long answer to that. The short answer is that we are part of this stream of consciousness that descended from this one source. So if you take a look at the typical Judeo-Christian version of creation, essentially it pictures human beings as these separate creations that were made out of the dust of the earth. And, we're kind of like these little wind-up dolls that were placed down here. And, oh, by the way, we sinned against God and pissed him off. And now we're forever trying to get back in his good graces, kind of like in here. So here's the difference. Pinocchio was a creation of Geppetto. Geppetto was the maker. Pinocchio was the thing that was made. That's the Judeo-Christian version. But in the Gnostic and the mystical version, and goes back to the Hindus also, that's not the way it was. We are actually emanations. That word emanation means a projection of an essence. It is of the same essence projected outward. Okay. So we are part of this conscious energy stream that was projected from the source itself. Now we get back into why do you perceive yourself as you or me, and why do we perceive a world around us? It's because of this limitation I spoke about. We are, even though we are part of that source consciousness, we are vastly limited parts of that source consciousness. So we don't perceive ourselves. We've forgotten ourselves as part of that source in effect. And we think of ourselves as these separate creations. And another analogy, this always gets into very dense stuff. So I always try and give people an analogy to help them understand. Think of a pure stream up in the mountains, a pure lake up in the mountains. It's absolutely pristine, but it flows down the side of the mountain like a waterfall. Okay. Now, as it flows down the mountain, it starts to pick up dirt and contaminants, and it gets down the bottom and it gets really muddy, but it's all part of the same stream. Okay. So the source itself is unlimited, but the stream itself picks up all kinds of pollutants and bad ideas and limitations and manifests as something that looks something different down at the bottom of the mountain. That's what we are. We're the stuff at the bottom.
Doesn't sound very appetizing, Peter.
No, sorry, we're bottom feeders. What can I tell
you? So we talked a little bit about the many worlds theory. Can you describe, or does the many worlds theory reflect ancient ideas of alternate realities?
The many worlds theory, again, you did accurately describe it in the sense that, for everything we do, every decision we make, an alternate reality is created. Really, I have not run into any ancient spiritual traditions that describe that at all.
Okay.
That's really more of one of several competing theories in quantum physics, along with string theory and other kinds of theories of multiverse and parallel universes. But I mean, strictly speaking, no. I mean, in terms of ancient spiritual texts, I've really not run into anything that is described like that.
So in the world that we live in this dimension that we live in currently, we have to deal with time and space. Where quantum physics is starting to throw that a little bit with quantum entanglement, time and space is starting to not be real anymore. So my question to you is, after speaking to so many people I've had a lot of near-death experiencers on, I've had quantum physicists on talking about the concept of reincarnation as a soul. And we're going a little bit more spiritual here, but I'll get back to quantum physics in a second. The idea that there is no past life and there is no future lives, that all lives are happening at the exact same time because there is no time or space on the other side. Is there anything in quantum physics that kind of can make sense of all of that at the exact same time? Or have you heard of anything in your research?
Absolutely. Yeah, I think you're right. I mean, at the most fundamental level of reality, there is no such thing as space or time. There only is. There's only consciousness, undifferentiated consciousness. The concept of space and time is, again, a function of the limitation. This is why I keep mentioning the word limitation, because it's apparent. What we view as reality is an apparent reality. It's what it seems like reality to us. Okay. Now, you mentioned the Matrix and you mentioned Neo. So strong indications are that essentially we're living in a holographic projection. Okay. And the hologram, the thing about a hologram is you can slice and dice a hologram up into any kind of parts you want, but each little piece of that hologram contains the image of the whole. Mm-hmm. So going back to quantum entanglement, how do you explain quantum entanglement? What that is like particles that are essentially like hundreds of thousands or millions of light years apart can instantly communicate with one another. So, like if there's an Alex on Mars and one here on Earth, and I pinch the one on Earth and one on Mars goes, ouch, at the exact same moment. How does that happen? I mean, you guys aren't connected by strings or a fiber optics or anything else that would help you communicate. So it's happening at an energetic level. Right. So essentially what they started developing this holographic universe theory by saying, you know what, maybe the way to explain this is that everything really is part of one whole and it's all happening at the same time. The only thing is we're only perceiving one part or one half or one little piece of the equation. We're not seeing the whole picture. So if we saw the whole picture, we would probably be transcending time and space. And yet we're stuck in our little perceptive corner, not seeing the entire hologram, but just seeing our little portion of the hologram. I mean, you've cited the Hindu tradition a couple of times. Now, you probably know the story of the elephant, right? And the blind.
Yes, of course. Yeah. Of course. Okay. Yeah, they're all seeing the part of the whole, right?
Yeah, exactly. So each of them feels a part of the elephant. That's their reality. That they're describing, what they think is the reality. They're not seeing the whole elephant. So I think there's your answer right there. I always thought that was a beautiful analogy to explain it.
Without question. So this cosmic hologram that we're talking about here, I mean, that is Maya in basically what the Hindus were talking about 7,000 years ago. Is that fair? Right.
Yes.
So then in other ancient wisdom that you've been able to see, or ancient civilizations, what other civilizations had these ideas of the great illusion? I mean, the two that I come up to mind are always the Hindus with Maya and the Aborigine with the great dream. Do you have any other examples of that kind of really bring it home to people that this concept of a holographic, non-real world that we live in is not just from 1999 when the Matrix came out? It's been around for quite some time.
Yeah, I mean, almost all the major religions. I mean, Gnosticism is a confluence of the Kabbalah, of Persian Zoroastrianism, of Hellenistic philosophy. It's really a combination of all those streams, and all those traditions describe some kind of process of oneness breaking itself up or limiting itself, descending down a ladder into multiplicity. And the multiplicity is duality, or multiplicity is where the illusion arises, because it all stems from one. I mean, look, a lot of people think that Hinduism is a polytheistic religion. At its heart, it's not. It's monotheistic at its heart, because there's one God, there is one entity, but it expresses itself in multiple forms. Okay, so I mean, even you have that in Christianity, where it's the Trinitarian Christianity. Now, Judaism on the surface has been more staunchly monotheistic, but that's an illusion too, because if you look at the Kabbalah, which is the mystical tradition of Judaism stemming back thousands of years, it's almost exactly the same as the Gnostics. They describe that reality as a contraction of the one mind, producing these various limitations and appearances of multiplicity. But it all boils down to one. It's all a matter of appearance, and that's where the Maya or the illusion comes in.
Is there any way that quantum physics and ancient wisdom kind of intersect when trying to understand consciousness?
There is, well, first of all, I have to say that for a long, long time now, science has done their best to avoid the idea of consciousness.
Correct.
In fact, today, if you talk about consciousness in scientific circles, it's called the hard problem. That's this common jargon to describe consciousness. It's called the hard problem, and it's called that for a reason, because they can't explain it. And actually, it really runs counter to scientific materialism. So we have to make a distinction in science, because there's been a traditional science, just like there was traditional religion. Okay. There has been a traditional orthodox version of science. The religion that scientists so criticize, I get a kick out of this, because there's a scientific orthodoxy that is every bit as dogmatic as the Catholic Church. Okay,
Oh,
and that scientific orthodoxy essentially tries to say that consciousness is the result of a physical process, that somehow inorganic matter became organic, and they never describe how that happens. And then, you have these single-celled organisms that were crashing into one another, eventually combining into more complex forms and evolving, and leading to higher forms of animal life, and eventually, voila, consciousness happens. It's a ridiculous explanation. I mean, it's so patently unscientific, and that's the way they try to, brush off the whole idea. Now, there is a growing minority, but it's a current that is really happening in science now, to understand that rather than a bottom-up process that happened in a material basis, it's consciousness that came first, and that the materiality is a result of consciousness starting from the top and working its way down to the bottom. So that really makes a lot more sense from so many different points of view, to view consciousness as primary over matter, rather than matter creating consciousness. And there are a number of different theories, but all kind of pointing towards the same thing, that are really being picked up and have been kind of stirring for decades now in science. Some of them are called panpsychism, which is the idea that consciousness is present in every single thing. It's only a matter of degree. So there's, the difference between us and a rock is a matter of degree of consciousness. There is a growing, I think, understanding that you get rid of so many paradoxes and unexplained phenomena that happen on a quantum and scientific basis when you start off with consciousness as your premise and then work your way down. So there is a interesting clash going on between traditional science and a burgeoning new view of consciousness, and it's going to be playing itself out, certainly from this point on.
Why do you think that at this point in human history, to our knowledge at least, this awareness is starting to creep in? And then not just in science and quantum physics, but these kinds of conversations are happening more and more in today's world than it would have 100 years ago. Mind you, we understand the internet, and it's a lot easier to get information. But why do you believe that there's this kind of awakening to a lot of these concepts and ideas?
Well, in my mind, it's very simple reason. It's because prior to 1900, we had no understanding of quantum physics. You go back to some of the classical thinkers and classical philosophers. I mean, it's incredible to me that the Greeks had a concept of atoms thousands of years ago. The Greeks were brilliant. But by and large, science up until 1900, when Max Planck the German physicists first started exploring the quantum world, there really wasn't a great understanding of the fact that we're composed of light energy. So all these discoveries in quantum physics now, and remember this, by and large, people have been living with different religious traditions, less so than spiritual traditions. The difference between religion and spirituality is that religion basically think of it as a box, and they say we have all the answers in this box, right? And those boxes are usually full of dogmas and things. Spirituality, on the other hand, is an open-ended process where people can go in and they can, have these spiritual understandings, but then they understand, I want to move on to the next level. So spirituality is more of a growth process. Religion is more of a stagnant process, but they still have had their concepts of things like the afterlife and the soul of and so forth and so on. But honestly, you've had people, the vast majority of people have had to take both religion and spiritual wisdom on faith. Now, faith is something that you get secondhand from somebody else, so you can believe it or not believe it, right? And faith can also be very much manipulated, because there's people with agendas out there, and they use faith, to manipulate
No,
other people.
stop it, Peter,
Oh
stop
yeah,
it.
I'm
I
sorry.
can't
I'm sorry
believe
to
you.
surprise. Sorry to surprise you. Sorry to pop that one on you. But faith, and faith has its place, but it
Yeah,
also has its drawbacks. Okay, what supersedes faith? The thing that supersedes faith is experiential knowledge. Now,
right.
what I mean by experiential knowledge is not stuff that you read in a book. That's factual or rote knowledge, and that has its place too. But experiential knowledge is like, okay, so I tell you that fire burns. Okay, now you can take that on faith, but you don't know for sure until you stick your hand in the fire. Once you stick your hand in the fire, you own that experience, and then you know it to be a reality. So I think that most people have had to take things on faith. It's like, yeah, I think so, but I don't know. That's what they tell me. And in all honesty, when you read spiritual texts, or you read the Bible or any other religious scripture, you really have to take these things on faith, whether or not there's really something there. But I think what happened was, with the rise of quantum physics from 1900 on, the rational part of people's minds, the left brains of people's minds, was being assaulted with new information. And that new information, as we've discussed today, started to support some of the things that these ancient traditions have said, that, hey, there ain't no such thing as a solid world in all reality. It's just the perception of one. What we view as the solid world is really kind of like a disturbance or blip in the quantum energy field from which everything arises. Yes, it's our limitations that prevent us from experiencing that, but people have experienced. I've experienced it. Okay, I mean, the reason why I'm an international businessman, the reason why I got into this, and the reason why I'm on your show, is because I had a series of vivid experiences that changed the course of my life. Now, in my case, they were spontaneous. Sometimes, if you're lucky, that happens to certain people. Most of the time, people have to arrive at these understandings through a more a course of study, experimentation, meditation, and everything else. And then they start to have those experiences with extraordinary consciousness that lead them to understand, hey, there's more to life than what I think there is. There really is something else out there. There's other forces out there that are at play here that affect this world. You can take that as an intellectual proposition, but again, once you get to the point where you've actually experienced these things and then you own it, you know it to be real. I know this stuff to be real in my gut, because I can cite you multiple instances of why I think that's real because of what I've been through. But everybody has to get to that place through a different door. And I do think that the development of quantum physics now gives us a scientific or kind of left brain approach to understandings of what we've had to take on faith for thousands of years. So I think it's that moment in 1900 that started to shift things.
If you don't mind me asking, would you like to share some of those spiritual experiences that you had?
Well, yeah, I don't mind. I mean, it all started off when I was in my 20s, and I found out that I was a medical intuitive, and I went to a group that at that time taught something called ESP, which is kind of fallen out of the lexicon nowadays, extrasensory perception, but that's what it was called back then. And I was sitting opposite somebody in a chair and just talking like I'm talking to you, and they were able to. This group had a collection of index cards where the people who had been through this course, and there were quite a few back then, had to bring in the name of an individual with either a medical or psychological problem or whatever, and they would have the information on this card. So one person would have the card, and the other person would essentially try and give the reading of what was going on. So it was pretty controlled, because the person who had the card was not allowed to lead you on in any way, and any response that you gave, if it was incorrect, they didn't want to discourage you by saying, hell no, you really missed that one. They would just simply say, I don't have that information here. But if you hit on something, they were able to say, yes, I have that information. Like, what else can you tell me? So the very first case that I got was a gentleman who actually happened to live in Miami Beach, where I am now. And he was 74 years old, and they just gave me his name, age, and address. And the very first thing that I was attracted to was the area of his heart. And it looked to me like his heart was tilted at a funny angle, causing the aorta to be pinched. And I said, I told them that, and they said, well, what does that mean to you? And I said, well, it means to me he has a blockage in his aorta. And they said, that's correct. They said, what else can you tell us? And I said, well, I feel something like metallic in the bottom quadrant of his heart. I think he had a pacemaker installed. And they said, that's correct. Can you tell us what year the pacemaker was installed? So I see in my mind, I see the hands of a clock spinning wildly, but then they stopped dead at 10 o'clock, which indicated to me 10 years prior. And so I stated, 10 years prior, and that was correct. So once I got over the rational kickback of what I was doing, and I was just able to let it go and experience it, it opened up just a whole slew of phenomena that I would experience: remote viewing, clairvoyance, clairaudience, premonitions. I actually used this to save my life in Africa one time. I was actually working in Nigeria in the 1970s, and it could be a pretty dangerous place over there. And there wasn't very good transportation, and we had to go from one city down south up north. It was about an 8-hour, 9-hour trip through the jungles, because the airplanes weren't working that day, which was pretty frequent. And we were just about to get into one of these transports that, carried, probably another half a dozen people. And the guy I was with, I felt something very strongly. And I said, I don't want to get in here. And he said, well, we got to be up here. We have an appointment. I said, I don't care. There's something wrong. And he thought I was crazy. But I was crazy enough to prevail upon him, and he didn't get in. Well, we found out the next day that same transport was attacked by brigands in the jungle, and a couple of the passengers were killed. So I had things like this. I don't want to sit here and give a recital of this, but these are the kind of things that I was happening. So what was happening? I mean, I was obviously communicating, with some higher form of energy.
And so then, when you started to understand this about yourself, how did you deal with it on a psychological standpoint? I mean, this is not normal. I was going to say, this is not normal talk back then. Even it's not normal talk now, but it's a little bit more understood and more mainstream now than it was back when when it was happening to you.
I had a very, very difficult time for a while, because I became like a psychic sponge. I literally would know conversations almost word for word 10 minutes before they were going to happen. I was on an airplane, and I had a stack of probably 100, 200 pages of documents. And I got off the airplane, and I had a flash in my mind that pages 10 and 11 were missing somehow. And I went back on the plane, and sure enough, 10 and 11 had fallen underneath the seat. So, it wasn't a good thing, because I didn't want to be in people's heads. I didn't want to invade their thoughts. But if somebody shook my hand, I know all kinds of things about them, things that I didn't necessarily want to know. And it was really difficult. And I had physical issues over it. And I actually went to London to the British Spiritualist Association in Belgravia Square to try and get some advice and some help at that time. So for a while, I just kind of fled it. And then later on, I kind of came back. I didn't really want to be in that level of knowing. It was too much. It was like having a spigot turned on and the water just gushing out. And I didn't want it to be like that. But I will say, I decided to write books to describe these experiences in order to help other people have an understanding of these things. And I wrote a trilogy, which became a 25-time award-winning trilogy. And the first book of that trilogy is about an African nun who becomes the first female pope at a time when America and Iran are going into a nuclear war. Well, at times I felt that book, I didn't even write that book. I felt it was written for me. And Om Times Magazine ended up doing an article on all the geopolitical predictions that came true in the book. And there were, a dozen that, predicted Iran going nuclear, or the second Gulf War, the fact that there would be a third world pope that was an Italian that would come from the third world. And Francis was the first one, and that he would take that pope would take a name that wasn't a typical papal name. And that was the first time that all these things were predicted in Pope Annalisa. So, I still use it. and I still use it in my writings, and I get information, but that's good. That I'm kind. I feel a little bit more in control of that. I no longer want to be at the point where I shake your hand and I know your whole history.
So it sounds like, I mean, if I may use the analogy of the water that you did before with consciousness, it seems like when we're incarnated, we're thrown from consciousness, pure consciousness, into the material space. And depending on where we are, where we have evolved to, depends on the level of how deep we go. Some people go all the way down to the bottom of the floor where the pressure and it's really hard to move. The vibration is extremely low, let's say, down there. And then as you start to evolve spiritually and start understanding more and more of how the game is played, what the rules are, you start evolving. Hence, the yogis or Jesus or these ascended masters start to going up to the point where you finally can break through the water again in an incarnation and understand, I see everything. Is that a fair analogy of what our soul is kind of going through?
Well, I believe it's probably true that souls come in at different levels of consciousness, come into the earth at different levels of consciousness. So maybe that's why some people, have spontaneous experiences like I had, and for other people,
Right.
it's more of a difficult process. I mean, that would make logical sense just to account for, things. However, the good news is that everybody can ascend. Everybody has that ability to trace their consciousness back towards the source consciousness, and achieve potentialities that we would say are remarkable for turning around people's lives. And the factors that are involved there, besides, let's say, level of soul awareness or soul growth that you reincarnate with, the factors that evolve there have a lot to do with things like your desire, your motivation, your ability to be open-minded, to use visualization, in the book Quantum Spirituality, I write about the factors of meditation and that help people to propel them to have these kind of extraordinary experiences. And there are different factors that can be played with that can accelerate people's growth.
Now, so when you were explaining what happened to you, it sounds like almost that when you came in an incarnation, you were at a higher level, but were unaware that you were at a higher level. Unlike someone who was training and going up and evolving and understanding slowly these abilities coming to them. These were thrust upon you and you weren't prepared for them, which probably was part of your evolution as a soul to deal with it in this lifetime. Is that a fair statement?
I think it could be a fair statement. Yeah.
Yeah. So that's how,
statement.
Because I've talked to so many different people who've had these extrasensory perceptions, whether it's a psychic medium or a channel or even near-death experiencers. Some of them, it's a smooth transition. Other ones are like, I feel like I'm going crazy because I hear voices. So it's just different levels of ability, but some are just aware of those abilities and can control them so much easier. And other ones, it's just kind of thrust upon. It'd be the equivalent of me all of a sudden being able to be Michael Jordan. and well, even better yet, if I was given $1 billion tomorrow, I don't know how I would deal with that because I'm not prepared intellectually, maybe emotionally, maybe spiritually on what that kind of responsibility and energy coming towards me in a life I would be able to deal with. Where you give that to Elon Musk or Jeff Bezos, that's just a Saturday morning for them.
Yeah, I mean, there was a time when I was younger where I felt I had one foot more in another world than this one. I was starting to lose my perception of myself as being part of this world, and I was like floating off into the wherever, into the
Ether.
great beyond.
Yeah.
And I felt very detached from this world. I'm often wondered if I had died at that time, I might not have even noticed it. And I tried. It got to a point where it was too very difficult to operate. And I think that the whole trick to this thing is you have to operate within the material world. I mean, I never subscribed to that ascetic, not aesthetic, but ASCETIC the monastic kind of existence where you just go off in a cave and you meditate. So I mean, to me, the whole idea is you take that consciousness, but you use it within this world. You use it for something. You use it within this world. So I never really understood that kind of, monastic thing, at least not for any great period of time, because to me, I feel that human beings are the fingers of God touching the face of this world, and that our task is to spiritualize the material and bring the experience of the material back to spirit. It's like a two-way communication. What higher consciousness gets the experience that it couldn't have of being in physical form through us, but by the same token, when we become more enlightened, we can handle this world in a more spiritual way and raise the vibration of this world. So human beings are actually a very important bridge between consciousness and matter, and that's a much more exalted position than what Judeo-Christianity has left us with as human beings, as these kind of lowly, separate Pinocchios running around here trying to get back in God's good grace.
Well, I mean, it was just what Jesus said. I mean, everything I could do, you could do and more. The kingdom of heaven is within you.
Right.
But these have been all, bastardized by the powers that be for control purposes, to control the public. Because if I tell you that, like, oh, you have all the power to talk to God, well, why do you need me? And so
you see what you just described. What you just described was Gnosticism and the fall of Gnosticism. The original mystical Christian message was just as you described it, and it was bastardized. There were two streams of Christianity. Okay, there was the inner mystical church, and then there was the outer church, the church of the platitudes, the beatitudes, the mass consumption church. And we know that for a fact. That's not speculation, because in the Bible it says that unto the disciples he gave the keys to the kingdom of heaven, but unto those without he spoke in parables. And we have further evidence of that in the writings of the early church fathers. So Clement of Alexandria and Origen, who were both early Christian bishops of Alexandria, which was a major Christian center at that time, the Greek city of Alexandria in Egypt, affirmed that Jesus had an inner mystical teaching that was not taught to the masses, because most of them wouldn't be able to understand it. So there was a mystical church right from the very beginning. And if you read the Gnostic Gospels, what you're seeing is what the original Jesus was teaching. What happened, unfortunately, was that just as you said, the outer church, which had a lesser understanding, started dogmatizing and codifying and messing around with the mystical teachings, and they twisted it in such a way as to create a hierarchy of power, of bishops, of priests, of bishops, and everything else. Of course, the Gnostics said, well, you don't need that. The church is not an intercessor between us and God. We have a direct line of communication. If we're but aware of it, we can have a direct line of communication. We don't need all this whole
pomp and circumstance.
And you interposing yourself between us and God. Of course, that was a major threat to the developing Orthodox Church, and eventually they had to eradicate the mystics. So we lost. We could have been as advanced in our spiritual understanding as some Hindu thinking in the West, but we lost that with the eradication of the Gnostics. And we lost that with the eradication of our Judeo-Christian mystical tradition.
That's something I've always wondered, because in the Hindu tradition, the mystics and the mystical aspects of it has been around for thousands of years and pretty in there. It wasn't really just touched too much, but there is. I've heard not rumors, but I've heard rumblings of the mystics in Judaism, and also in Christianity, but not as much in Christianity as it was the mystics in Judaism. But it is something that is really just kind of tampered down and put into the back room and not allowed to come up, but it is there without question.
Okay. So yeah, you really hit on something here. So take the three Abrahamic religions,
right?
Judaism, Christianity, Islam. Okay. Judaism had the Kabbalah, Christianity had the Gnostics, and Islam had the Sufis. So those three, the Sufis, the Gnostics, and the Kabbalists were the mystical traditions, the inner core or mystical traditions of each of their outward religions. And in fact, they had more in common with one another than they had with their own outward traditions. Okay. The Sufis, the Gnostics, And the Kabbalists were pretty much saying the same thing that I've described to you here. What I described as Gnosticism, could easily be interchangeable with Islamic Sufism or Judaic Kabbalism. So the Christian tradition, though, was much more suppressed, and that's why you don't hear as much from them. Somehow the Kabbalah was able to, survive, and the Sufis were able to survive into the modern age, but the Catholic Church did an incredible job with Roman efficiency of eradicating the mystical tradition, and that's why you don't hear as much about it. But the Gnostic Gospels, there was a big find in 1945, the same year that the atomic bomb came into existence, and I do not think this is a coincidence. That they found a major cache of the Gnostic Gospels, and for the first time, we were able to hear the voices of the Gnostic masters, whereas prior to that, primarily, we had to understand the Gnostics through the writings of their enemies, the Church Fathers, describing them. So Gnosticism is making its way back into the mainstream. I'm not the only one who's writes about Gnosticism. There's a lot of scholars out there, Elaine Pagels and Stephen Haller. There's a lot of people out there that write about Gnosticism. In fact, if you Google it or you go to Amazon Books, I'm sure you'll find scores of books on Gnosticism. But the Gnostic wisdom is coming back into the mainstream to our benefit.
And I mean, it was the Roman Catholic Church. And by the way, please forgive me. When I went to Italy and I went to Vatican City, at that one moment, I realized all my life I was raised a Roman Catholic. I was like, oh my God, I never connected Rome with Catholicism. I just never connected to be like, oh my God, it was Constantine. It was a Roman emperor who set all this up and started in the Council of Nicene and all this kind of stuff. And getting rid of a lot of the Gnostic texts and getting rid of all the mystical stuff, and God forbid reincarnation is in there, and all of that kind of stuff was pulled out. It is something that information is slowly starting to seep its way back into the mainstream because of shows like this, because of the freedom of information that we have now with the internet. And I don't believe that that's an accident, that it's happening at this point.
Yeah, it's pretty accurate what you described. So essentially, Constantine saw a way to unify the Roman Empire, which was fragmenting socially and politically, and he saw the religion as a tool to do that. And what way to snap people in line better than to religiously? I mean, you make fanatics out of them. So that had a lot to do with it, in the councils that happened afterwards. The Chalcedon and Nicaea and everything else. Started to describe what it meant to be an Orthodox Christian. Orthodox meaning right thinking in Greek. Okay, so you had the Orthodox Catholic Church back in those days. I mean, they eventually separated into the Eastern Roman Empire, became Orthodox, and the Western Roman Empire was Catholic, but originally they were Orthodox Catholic. The very word itself, Orthodox, means right thinking. Heretic means someone who ain't thinking right. So the heretics, you and
I, sir, are heretics, obviously.
Yeah. The heretics actually were the ones who kind of had were kind of really clued in, unfortunately.
It is fascinating how this is all coming. Do you believe that there is a awakening in consciousness of humanity, even though there is all this insanity happening in the world, that there is this kind of shift and opening and awakening?
Yeah, and I think a lot of it has to do with a recognition of the sacred feminine. I mean, look, years ago, a couple decades ago, when I go to consciousness gatherings like Whole Life Expo or any of these
consciousness,
it would be like there'd be 200 people in the room, there'd be 199 women and me. And now you go to these and it's pretty much equal. And I think what's happening is that things kind of cycle around, and the feminine principle of life has a lot to do with relying on intuition and feeling as opposed to rational, analytic, and logical. So we've been in that rational, analytical, and logical mind state for many centuries now. And I think that people are starting to understand that subjective consciousness is probably even more important gateway to understanding reality than science is. But let me just say they're equal, okay? At the very least, they're equal. You can approach reality from a scientific standpoint, which takes a look at nature and then kind of works its way up. Or you can approach it from a subjective standpoint, which is getting insights and intuition that come from the top and then working your way down. And eventually they meet in the middle somewhere. So metaphysics to me is just as important as physics itself, as quantum physics. And, you have a left brain and a right brain, right? Okay, so the right brain is your more intuitive and feeling nature where it resides, and in the left brain, it's more analytical and logical. I think what's happening now is people are becoming more balanced. So instead of being one or the other, I think we're becoming both. And in fact, the psychologist Carl Jung said exactly that when you you merge that left brain and right brain, that's when you become an actualized being. Well, that's the same thing that Jesus said in the Gnostic Gospels. He said, when the male becomes the female and the female becomes the male and the two become one, then you will realize the kingdom of heaven, then you will move mountains.
Now, Peter, I'm going to ask you a few questions I ask all my guests. What is your definition of living a fulfilled life?
Well, I think something that makes you feel good. I think doing something that makes you feel worthwhile, helpful, in service to others, performing something that a task that transcends yourself, and that has a lot to do with being of service to others. I mean, I honestly, what I'm doing now, being on your show and everything, takes away from my business life. Okay, but I'm happy to do that because I feel, what I'm trying to do is help other people get to the point where they have these experiences with higher or extraordinary consciousness, because then I believe they become better human beings. I believe it helps their lives out. And so that's why I do this. So for me, that's fulfilling. If I were simply going about business and earning money all the time, well, that would be great. There's nothing wrong with money, let me tell you, but that would not be, for me, not be a fulfilled life.
If you could go back in time and talk to little Peter, what advice would you give him?
I think I would probably have said, be a little bit more at ease with the world. I always felt when I was young a sense of alienation that something was wrong here, that I didn't really fit in, that there had to be way more than what I was feeling. And it really, in some ways that was good, because maybe that's what was my spark, that led me on to this. Or maybe that was the early indication of where my later life would head, was this feeling of alienation, or something else is going on here. And emotionally, I probably would have said, ease up a little bit. Don't let it worry you so much. Don't be so concerned about it. Just go with the flow and let it unfold itself. I probably would have said, yeah, that's what I probably would have told myself.
How do you define God or source energy?
Consciousness that expresses itself through the vehicle of light. And light is conveys intelligence, and intelligence means intention. So really, there is information that is encoded in light energy, just the same way that DNA encodes the information that shapes our body. I believe that light energy encodes the information that shapes our world, that shapes our universe, that shapes creation. So that God essentially is that consciousness that conveys itself through those mediums.
And what is the ultimate purpose of life?
Like I think I said it before, I think the ultimate purpose of life is to, as human beings, is to spiritualize the material and bring the experience of the material back to spirit.
And where can people find out more about you and the work that you're doing?
Yeah, I think the best place to go is my website, petercanova.com. That's PETERCANOVA.com. It tells about my works, the trilogy that I mentioned, and my new book, Quantum Spirituality, which incidentally, the first, my publisher just entered it, the first of a number of book contests, the American Book Fest. They entered it in 4 categories, and it won in all 4 categories. So
wow.
it's a real dot connector. I mean, it encompasses quantum physics, the ancient spirituality we've been talking about, Jungian psychology. It takes several different disciplines and it correlates them and shows how they're saying the same thing and giving the same indicators. So really what it is, it's like our roadmap for people who are on a spiritual journey. And it kind of has sign points that indicate things to look at, things to consider, directions to go in to enhance your spiritual growth. I cannot tell anybody how to conduct their own spiritual life, but what I can do is set up an arena of knowledge and information for them to work in and then launch themselves off on their own path.
Peter, it has been a pleasure and honor talking to you, my friend. It was a very fascinating conversation, and hopefully it's going to help a few souls out there. So I appreciate you, my friend.
Thank you for having me.
Thanks for watching. Click on one of the videos below to continue your journey, and don't forget to subscribe.